May I speak in the name of our loving, liberating, and life-giving God. Amen. Please be seated. Not long ago, I caught up with one of my uncles, who is, as they say, a character. Living in North Florida, which confusingly is definitely the South, he is the kind of guy who loves hush puppies and crawdads, fishing and hunting, always telling self-deprecating stories so funny you end up doubled over in laughter, all with a Marlboro Red perpetually hanging from his lower lip. His family has lived in the same quiet neighborhood for over 20 years, and they've built strong relationships with their neighbors. Recently, he and the other guys at the end of their cul-de-sac took up brewing beer. It all started when one guy gifted the others 6-packs of his own homebrew, then a private hobby, and piqued their interest. Now, months later, they all toil in their respective garages, and then every Sunday night get together to play cornhole, tinker with their cars, talk, and share their bubbly concoctions. And because these are all Bible-loving Christians, they call themselves, wait for it, the Hebrews. Now, this undertaking is, in some ways, not out of character, though I had trouble imagining him fussing over flavor notes and nuance like my friends who love craft beer here. But as he talked more about this hobby, it became clear that this newfound weekly ritual was about beer, but it was also about so much more than beer. The Hebrews had become the center of his week, the highlight, the time when he and his best friends connected and conspired and caught up. They talked about their lives, their frustrations, their marriages. They planned and plotted projects and programs for their community. They even prayed with and for each other. It turns out several of the guys don't even drink. The gatherings were about homebrew, but they were really about friendship. I've been thinking, in this season of celebration and gift-giving, how gifts are like this. They are about the things we give and receive, but they are also about so much more. A few months ago, as we began our stewardship campaign, I opened an adult forum by inviting everyone to turn to a neighbor and talk about a gift they'd given that meant a great deal to them and a gift they'd received that meant a great deal to them. About 10 minutes of lively conversation ensued, at the end of which we gathered back in a circle and I asked if anyone would like to share. Several people talked about how warm and happy they felt recalling those stories and how much more connected they felt to the person with whom they'd been talking, like they'd shared something precious, welcomed them into some tender place. Many people said the gifts discussed were not big, fancy, expensive, or impressive by any other worldly standard, but they were gifts that had touched them. And everyone talked about the curious fact that what they ended up sharing most about were the people involved in these exchanges, the relationships implicated, who had given or received this gift, and why it had meant so much. The stories that filled those 10 minutes were not about the details of the things themselves, but the details of the relationships that gave those things so much meaning. Today, we celebrate the feast of the Epiphany. It is, for many Christians around the world, the primary celebration of Christ's incarnation, surpassing even Christmas. And as today's gospel recounts, we recall a wonderful and richly textured story with all the trappings of a feature film: the majestic star, an epic journey, an evil villain, the adoration at the manger. But if you look to most dramatic and artistic depictions of this tale, like the one on the cover of our bulletins, this story is often reduced to a story about gifts, a story about gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The only problem is this doesn't really seem like the central plot in Matthew's text. The real story the original story, is infinitely more nuanced and surprising. This is, indeed, a story about gifts, but not in the way we usually think. It begins, as all the accounts of Jesus' birth do in the Gospels, by situating the story in political history. It was, Matthew tells us, the time of King Herod. Now, Herod was the king of Judea, and as such, a representative of the Roman Empire. He was a puppet, straddling the uncomfortable and growing chasm between the Jews he supposedly represented and the occupying empire reigning and raging over them. And into this delicate situation, this precarious balance, come wise men from the east, asking about a newborn king of the Jews. Disturbing news for Herod, to say the least. We know precious little about these men. We have no reason to think they were kings, no reason to think there were just 3 of them, and no idea where the east really was, other than, eastward. For a story that begins with such specificity, it quickly opens out, quickly becomes expansive. It was the time of King Herod, and wise men had come to Jerusalem, but these wise ones could have been anyone. They could have been your rowdy uncle or your curious cousin. They could have been you. They could have been me. And perhaps, in a sense, they are. And while we may not know where they're from, we can deduce some important things about them nonetheless. That they were reading the signs around them. They were attending to the natural world enough to notice a star rising, and were also able, somehow, to recognize that star as a sign, to connect this phenomenon to a wider story. They were observant, thoughtful, and willing. But apparently, even with all the information they got from that star, it wasn't enough to get them all the way to Bethlehem. It was enough to get them moving, like the deep tug within when we know we are being called out of ourselves, being called into another phase of life, another chapter, some new adventure, whether we are ready or resistant. But as so often happens on our own journeys, they didn't get all the information at the outset about where precisely they were going or how to get there. Not at first. So instead, they go to Jerusalem. They turn, or perhaps return, to the familiar, a site of strength, a center of knowledge. If they are to make sense of this new thing, they will need to consult the tradition out of which it comes. And doesn't that also say something about how we walk our paths? Aren't we always interpreting what lies ahead in light of the past, figuring out where we are going by rediscovering where we have been? So the wise men come to Jerusalem, and they run into Herod, the single person most hostile to the new life God is conspiring to bring into the world. The very same Herod whose own son, in just a few chapters, will conspire with the Romans to finally put this holy child to death. And incredibly, Herod helps them, perhaps in spite of himself, figuring he will still be able to control things, to manipulate the situation in ways that will work out in his favor. And yet the story of these wise ones involves this dubious character, casting a dark shadow, who nevertheless shapes their journey, even helps them find their way forward. How many of our stories include similar people who have hurt us, disappointed us, let us down, but whom we can't leave out when we talk about our past, because they nevertheless played an important role. People we might wish weren't a part of our journey, except that we don't know who we would have become without them. So the wise men, perhaps oblivious to Herod's intentions, perhaps not, share that they are looking for this king, and they also name for the first time the real gift they intend to bring. Homage, not gold, frankincense, or myrrh, but the gift of their devotion and honor, their respect and loyalty. A gift that is, by worldly definitions, not all that impressive, but it is the kind of gift we never forget, the gift of connection, the gift of relationship. With the help of the chief priests and scribes, Herod sends them on their way to Bethlehem, and suddenly the star reappears. And this time it is much more helpful, a veritable celestial GPS, guiding them right to the house where Mary and Joseph have apparently moved in the post-census sale on Airbnb. And seeing that the star has stopped above this holy place, these wonders are filled with joy, and they enter the house and meet Mary and Jesus, and kneeling, they pay him homage, just as they always intended. They offer the gift they brought with them from the start. While much has been made of the gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and all they might mean, like that they foreshadow important aspects of Jesus' life, they seem here almost an afterthought. Like mid-bow, one of them realized they were essentially uninvited guests, elbowed the other, and whispered, "Did you bring a bottle of wine? Some flowers? A fruitcake? Well, let's see what we have in the camel sacks." I suppose these things, random as can be, will have to do. They have finally found the child, whose star they observed at its rising. But their journey, like that of every pilgrim, is not over. They got where they were going, but they have still got to get home. Bethlehem is, in a sense, for them, as it is always for us, another beginning, the beginning of the journey back, a journey that will be strange and unfamiliar, not only because they have been warned in a dream not to return to Jerusalem, but because they have been too changed, too transformed to take the same road. There is, ultimately, no going back, even in returning to their own country. So, yes, this is a story about the giving of gifts, gifts of homage, gifts of things, but it is also about so much more. It is the story not only of the gifts given by the wise men, but of the gifts they received. It's a story about God's great gift, God's greatest gift, not only to the wise ones, the Jews or the Hebrews, but to the world, to all the people of every nation, the gift of the life of God's Son, the gift of God drawing near to us, kneeling, stooping, bowing even, to express God's devotion, love, and loyalty to us, a motley crew of creatures, if ever there was, as wild and diverse a cast of characters as can be imagined. It is the story of a God who gifts us with divine presence, with insight and imagination, who offers signs and stepping stones, who conspires to turn our hearts and take us home. So, no wonder we tell this story over and over again, the story of gifts given and gifts received. No wonder it fills us with awe and wonder, with gratitude and longing. No wonder it inspires and encourages us, challenges and changes us. It is, after all, a story about gifts, and in that it is a story about so much more than the offerings themselves. It is at its core about the relationship that gives those gifts their meaning, a relationship that calls us up and out of our ordinary lives to draw ever closer to a God who is always drawing closer to us. It is indeed the adventure of a lifetime, even our lifetime. Amen.